On today's episode, I'm going to talk about another argument for the deity of Christ that groups like Trinitarians, Binitarians, and Modalists might make to show that Jesus is God as part of showing their particular view of how their view of God makes sense. This argument would not help any of these groups distinguish their particular view from each other, but they basically would all agree in general, I think, that this will be an argument for the deity of Christ. So this is not really going to be a comparison video of 6 different views. It's really going to be 3 different ways of looking at the same set of ideas. So from the perspective of people who do believe in the deity of Christ, this will be sort of a deductive argument that relies on 2 premises. Premise 1 is that God does not share his glory with anyone else. And premise 2, that Jesus shares in God's glory, which leads to the conclusion that Jesus must be God in some sense because he shares in God's glory. They would make this argument from a few different verses. One is in Isaiah 42:8, which says, I am the Lord, that is my name. My glory I give to no other, nor my praise to carved idols. And Isaiah 48:11, which says pretty much the same thing. And so they basically take this verse to mean that God does not share his glory with anybody else. He keeps it all for himself. And so that would be their basis for premise 1, which is God does not share his glory with anyone. And here's a couple verses that they might use for premise 2. Acts 3:13 says, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, the God of our fathers, glorified his servant Jesus, whom you delivered over and denied in the presence of Pilate when he had decided to release him. So they make the case that the same God, the one who is speaking in Isaiah 42:8, that he has glorified his servant Jesus. Therefore, because God glorified his servant Jesus, and God doesn't share his glory with anyone, therefore Jesus must also be God. All right, it's another verse of John 17:5. This is part of a prayer that Jesus was praying to the Father. And it says, and now, Father, glorify me in your own presence with the glory that I had with you before the world existed. And you may recall, if you've listened to it already, that I spoke about this verse at some length in episode 24. So if you haven't listened to that, you can go back and hear more details about a separate question about the pre-existence of Jesus and how that this verse is often used to make that case. But people often also will use it in combination with Isaiah 42:8 and 48:11 to show that Jesus receives glory from the Father and with the Father, and that shares in that same glory, and therefore Jesus is God. That's basically what this argument boils down to. Is premise 1, God does not share his glory with anybody else. Premise 2, Jesus shares in God's glory, and therefore Jesus must be God in some sense because he shares in God's glory. And again, none of this would decide between Trinitarianism, Binitarianism, and Modalism, but all those groups would generally agree that this argument for the deity of Christ supports at least part of their view of who Jesus is. Now, there's at least 2 perspectives that people who don't believe in the deity of Christ might have about this. In one of these views, they would agree that God does not share his glory with anyone, but they would disagree about premise 2, about Jesus sharing in God's glory. Now, these groups would not necessarily be saying that Jesus is not worshipped or that he doesn't receive glory, but the distinction that they would be making is whether or not Jesus shares in the same glory that God has. And so they might point out that people are given the same glory that Jesus is given. So in John 17:20 and 22, it says, I do not ask for these only, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, that they may all be one, just as you, Father, are in me, and I in you, that they also may be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. The glory that you have given me, I have given to them, that they may be one even as we are one. So this group might make the case that Jesus was given glory by the Father, and that he had given that same glory to other people. And they might also cite John 5:44, which says, "How can you believe when you receive glory from one another and do not seek the glory that comes from the only God?" Again, this was Jesus talking in this verse as well. And so basically they made the case that people besides Jesus receive glory from God. And pretty much nobody argues that the rest of us are also God. And if we're given the same glory that Jesus is given, then it doesn't really make sense to say that Jesus is God on the basis of being given the same glory that we are. So they might say that they might grant the idea that God does not share his glory with anybody else, but that he does give a different glory both to Jesus and to us. So that's really the simpler of the two alternatives to understand that the people who do not believe in the deity of Christ might offer as an explanation for how it is that God can share glory with Jesus and Jesus not be God, because he also shares glory with us and we're not God. But it's just a different kind of glory than he reserves for himself. So that's one possible way they might talk about it. The other way that they might explain this is they might say that people misunderstand what God is saying in Isaiah 42:8, when it says, "I am the Lord, that is my name. My glory I give to no other, nor my praise to carved idols." They might say that God is not saying that he doesn't share his glory with anybody whatsoever, but rather that he only shares his glory with the people he's already been talking about prior to this verse. If you go back to verse 1 of 42, it says, "Behold my servant whom I uphold, my chosen in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry aloud or lift up his voice, or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and a faintly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice. He will not grow faint or be discouraged, till he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands wait for his law. Thus says God the Lord, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread out the earth and what comes from it, and who gives breath to the people on it, and spirit to those who walk in it. I am the Lord, I have called you in righteousness. I will take you by the hand and keep you. I will give you as a covenant for the people, a light for the nations, to open the eyes that are blind, to bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, from the prison, those who sit in darkness. I am the Lord, that is my name. My glory I give to no other." And they make the case that this is about God's people and that he is going to share his glory with them, and that Jesus is specifically the one in view that is being talked about here in the first several verses. It's quoted later in Matthew 12:18 to 21. They make the case that in the original context, it was Israel that was being spoken about in the first part of Isaiah 42, and that it was applied to Jesus in a typological way. So, like the nation of Israel was the type, and Jesus was the future fulfillment in full of what that type was going to be. And basically, what they're saying is that God shares his glory with Israel. And since Israel is all of God's chosen people, not just the ethnic Jews or ethnic Israelites, but also Jesus and all the Gentiles who were then later grafted in, that God can share the same glory that he has with his people. And so there's a number of verses that they might cite to make this case. They might start with Hosea 11:1, which says, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." And Matthew cited this verse in Matthew 2:15 and said, "And remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I have called my son." And they might make the case that this connection of Israel being called God's son and Jesus being called God's son in the same sense is connecting Israel and Jesus in this deep way. And they might make the case that there are other passages that talk about how the Israelites receive glory. For example, Isaiah 55:5 says, "Behold, You shall call a nation that you do not know, and a nation that did not know you shall run to you because of the Lord your God and of the Holy One of Israel, for he has glorified you. So this is God glorifying Israel. And Romans 9:4 says, they are Israelites, and to them belong the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the worship, and the promises. And so again, here talking about the Israelites and that they have glory. 2 Corinthians 3:18 says, and we all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. Basically, they make the case that we're all being transformed into the same glory that Jesus has and the same glory that God has. I might also cite 2 Peter 1, verses 3 and 4, which says, his divine power has granted to us all things that pertain to life and godliness, through the knowledge of him who called us to his own glory and excellence, by which he has granted to us his precious and very great promises, so that through them you may become partakers of the divine nature, having escaped from the corruption that is in the world because of sinful desire. So I make the case that we are called to his own glory and excellence, so that we, not just Jesus, but that we too are supposed to share in the same glory that God has, even sharing his divine nature, it says. I might talk about Galatians 6:16, which says, and for all who walk by this rule, peace and mercy be upon them, and upon the Israel of God. And I think that the Israel of God is all of God's people, not just the Jews or the ethnic Israelites, but all people who are in Christ, partly because of what it says in Galatians 3:7, which says, know then that it is to those of faith who are the sons of Abraham. They're making the case that it's not just the ethnic Israelites, but it's the people who have faith, who are the sons of Abraham. They're counted as his sons because of their faith. And passages like Romans 10:12, which says, there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord is Lord of all, bestowing his riches on all who call on him. So basically the point here is that the second group of people who do not believe in the deity of Christ, that they would deny the other premise. So whereas the first group that I was describing says, maybe you're right, maybe God doesn't share his glory with anybody but himself, but Jesus and we receive different glory. So they deny premise 2. Whereas the second group, they think that when it says that God does not share his glory with anyone, that it's kind of like if a man was going to say to his wife, I will never give my love to another. He doesn't mean that he is going to only love himself and not love his wife. He means that he's not going to give his love to a different woman than her. And so in the same way, they would be saying that God doesn't share his glory with anybody else other than his people. And that because Jesus and the rest of the people who are incorporated into Jesus through faith and obedience, that they are all part of God's people. And so he does share his glory with them. And so, because it's pretty clear that God does give glory to other people in the scriptures, sometimes when people who do believe in the deity of Christ come to see all these other passages where other people are glorified, if they're going to still stay with their idea that God doesn't share his glory with anybody else except Jesus, then they would then have to say something more like that God shares his special glory only with Jesus, but gives a different kind of glory to other people. So since it's pretty clear that other people in Scripture are given glory by God, once people who believe in the deity of Christ see that, they might just abandon this part of their argument altogether, or they could instead say that God shares his glory, his special glory that's only for himself, with Jesus. And so, therefore, their argument is still valid and sound that God only shares his glory with Jesus, and that because Jesus shares in God's glory, that Jesus must therefore be God. But the glory that he gives to other people is different. So they could either say that, or they could just abandon this whole argument altogether because of something like the reasons that the other groups might give in John 17:20, 22, where it says, "The glory that you have given me, I have given to them." If they then see that it's the same glory that Jesus has that other people have, then they might still believe that Jesus is God, but they might just give up this one argument and believe that he's God for other reasons. So anyway, hopefully that makes sense. If you find this helpful, then like and subscribe and visit our website at understandingperspectives.com. You can find the podcast on your favorite app by searching for Understanding Perspectives or at the link in the notes below. May God bless you.